Hi everyone, I'm BJ Jamison. I'm the Genealogy Reference Specialist at the Maine State Library. And today I'm going to talk about finding a person's Scottish origins in US records, because having something more than just Scotland is very helpful for finding who you're looking for in Scottish records. I joke frequently that when I went looking for my great-grandfather, William Patterson, the problem wasn't that I couldn't find him. The problem was that I found 157 William Pattersons, and knowing which one was the right one was based on information I had from records in the US that allowed me to eliminate most of them and then just look at about 3 of them as possibilities. So there are essentially 3 eras of immigration to the United States: the colonial era, the 19th century, and these don't quite add up. It's colonial era goes up until about 1820, 19th century is about 1820 to 1905, and then 20th century immigration laws are basically 1906 and later. So for the colonial era, almost no actual immigration records exist. No passenger lists, nothing like that. Almost no naturalizations, because up until the time of the American Revolution, it was not necessary. British colonies. What early ship lists there are reconstructed from other records. Even the Mayflower passenger list is reconstructed from later Pilgrim and Puritan writings. So if you have ancestors who came here to the US before 1820, you're going to be looking at later records on the family to see about figuring out if you can find where they came from. The 19th century records start in 1820, essentially, which is when the federal government started requiring a ship captain give a passenger list to the local customs official when they arrived in a port. And there were not standardized forms for these, and often there's not much more than a name, age, and country of origin. You will get families together if they travel together. A lot of times you don't even get an occupation. I've very rarely seen anything other than just Scotland as an origin. In 1891, the Bureau of Immigration was established as part of the Treasury Department, and they administered all immigration laws, which meant regulating who could come into the country. There were still very few regulations. They were basically excluding polygamists, anarchists, convicts, and prostitutes. And even that, it was asking, are you a prostitute or a convict? And obviously, most people at that point would say no. The one thing that happened is that you do in the 1890s start seeing pre-printed forms with standard columns for passenger lists, which means that you do get usually an occupation as well as sometimes something more than just Scotland as the place of birth. And then in 1906, the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization was established. They did standardized forms and requirements for entry at all of the ports of entry around the US. This is also the point, and I'm not really talking about naturalization today, but this also is the point where naturalization is taken over by the federal government. Before this point, any court in the US, from a county court up through a federal court, could naturalize somebody. And the declaration of intention and the naturalization did not have to be in the same court either. And so that can make finding pre-1906 naturalizations quite difficult. And so this is helpful because after this point, it's standardized and the naturalizations are all federal records after 1906. Up until 1922, if a woman who was not a citizen either married a citizen or her husband became a citizen, she was naturalized at the same time. And when women were finally given the right to vote in 1920, this obviously had a bit of a domino effect And so in 1922, a woman's citizenship is separated from that of her husband. So before 1922, you really don't see much in the records for women on their own. And then finally, in 1924, the immigration system, in terms of allowing people in to settle here as immigrants, changed considerably with a quota system that definitely favored those coming from Northern and Western Europe. So generally, those coming from the UK would have gotten in, especially if they already had family here. So if actual passenger lists and naturalization records don't have good information past Scotland, where can you find where somebody was from? Well, these are the list. This is a list of the items that I have found the most useful over the years. Military records, Social Security records, other later immigration records, obituaries and other newspaper information, histories written about towns or counties or churches, church records, and alien registrations from the 2 world wars. So I'm going to go through these and show you some samples. And there are other things that work, but they're much quirkier. They're much harder to get a hold of. These are the easiest to get a hold of and the most likely to have details. So military records, here are 2 draft registrations for men born in Scotland. The one on the left is a man who was born in Scotland, was living here in 1918 when all of the men living in the US, whether they were citizen or not, had to if they were born between 1875 and 1900, had to register for the draft. And many of these, as you can see, do actually have some level of something beyond Scotland, because many of the forms did actually say town. And so this is a sample of an Edwin Reed, who is still a UK citizen at this point. And so it gives you the information about where he was born and an exact birth date. And my experience with these records is that they tend to be fairly accurate. The one thing I have noticed is that it's not unusual if somebody is from the Edinburgh or Glasgow area, but not from right in the city, they may still say that. So that's something to keep in mind, that if somebody does say, for example, Edinburgh, there's a chance they're from a nearby area. So this is World War I. This is the World War II Old Man's Draft. Again, it's capturing people born in the late 1800s. This is actually my grandfather. He is a naturalized citizen at this point, but again, giving his birthplace and exact birth date. And the other advantage to both of these records is these draft records for World War I were done in 1918. For World War II, they're done between 1940 and 1942. So you can cross-check them with census records from 1920 and 1940. The other nice thing, and they didn't ask it for the Old Men's Draft, but for the World War I draft, they did ask about prior military service. And so you can see that this Edwin Reed served 2 years in the British Army, according to him. And so that may be a place to find other records that might have even more detail about where he was from in Scotland. Social Security in the US started in the 1930s. And so anyone who was working here in that time period was supposed to sign up. And the records have not been digitized. They're indexed at Ancestry, and they do have a fairly decent indexing system, but you have to spend money with the Social Security Administration to get the actual file. I found in most cases, this index is enough to give me what I need. You'll see here in the middle, it's the full index record, my grandfather, birth date, and you'll notice again, here he says Leith rather than Edinburgh. He died in 1946, and this is a date, if you're wondering why there's something from 1976 from somebody who died in 1946. My grandmother died a few months before this, and there must have been some change to the record at that point. Here you have a William Scott, again, tells where within Edinburgh, gives a birth date, gives parents' names, which this one here you have Anne McDougall, and it gives her parents' names, which means you get her maiden name. So those are a really handy record. And these are not the death index. These are the claims index that's at Ancestry. The death index does not have, it has the exact birth date, but it does not have the birthplace or the other information such as on parents. So you want to make sure that you're in the claims index, not the death index. Many people who came to the US at some point went back. This is a case either where my grandmother was temporarily going back. She had my oldest uncle who was a year old. And as you can see, this is going, coming back from Scotland after her visit. And she's listed here, gives her citizenship, where she was born. This is her passport. Sorry, this is her a travel document number, where it was issued, and where she's headed. And you'll notice here my uncle, it said, this is a list, they generally only wrote down or did the manifest for non-citizens, but because my uncle was a year old and traveling with my grandmother, he's listed here with the non-citizens, even though he is a US citizen. And then this is one later when my grandmother's going, that same uncle married a woman from France. And so after the couple grandchildren were born, my grandmother went to visit them in France. And so this only says Scotland, but it gives you information that could lead you back to other records that would have more detail. So this is the date she was naturalized, the court she was naturalized in, and this was done in a federal court in Buffalo. This is her passport number, so there's going to be a passport application. And I can tell you off the top of my head, because I've looked for it, the Buffalo courts naturalizations have not been digitized. So I would have to either go to or write to the court to get this record. Obituaries are another good source of information. One of my favorite websites for this is fultonhistory.com, heavily New York state oriented, but it's free. And so if you have family from the New York area and the states surrounding it and into Southern Ontario, there's fairly good coverage of records there. And so this is a Jemima Patterson who died. And as you can see here in this close-up, it says she was born in Edinburgh, gives an exact date, gives who her parents were, and actually even gives you a clue as to when they came to the US. And what's interesting is they went to Toronto and then came to the US, which is, again, a very typical pattern. So if you're not finding your ancestor in US records, try Canadian records, because they may well have come in via Canada, because that was, particularly after things started tightening up into the 20th century, it was often cheaper to go to Canada, easier, and there may well have already been other family there. There was a rash of town and county histories written in the US in the late 1800s. Many of these have been digitized, and they're sort of the equivalent of the 19th century's version of Ancestry hints. Some of them will have really good information, some of them won't, but it's worth looking because many of them, if somebody had come here and was doing fairly well, they would be written up in these histories. And often, I don't tend to consider the claims made about someone's social prominence that reliable, but it's not unusual to mention a place where somebody came from in their country of origin or where their grandfather came from. So particularly if you have immigrants coming before 1850, it's worth looking to see if their grandchildren, for example, are listed in one of these books and would have information about where the grandparents or great-grandparents came from. Archive.org has many of these, state libraries, state universities. These are a few examples. You know, this is the first 4 I came to in putting in Kennebec County, Maine, which is where the state library is. And I could have put another dozen here. So, and that's just for one county in Maine. So, you know, there are lots of these. There was a similar rash of church histories done. And because many of the Scots who came to the US were Presbyterian, here's 3 sample Presbyterian church histories. This first one is from New Jersey, from Pennsylvania, and from Kansas. And again, they will often mention where early members of the church came from. And so that's a valuable tool. Church records often list where somebody was born, especially in the marriage records. Ancestry has a huge database of Presbyterian church records that may have these. Here's another one where you have Glasgow, you've got Edinburgh, you've got a couple more detailed ones, and then here at the bottom you have one where it just says Scotland, which is not that much help, but at least it's something. And it may well be that tracing her new husband will be the best way to find information on her. And the other thing to look for in the church records is the registers. And needless to say, when I went to find one of the ones I've used in the past, where someone had transferred from a Scottish church to a US church, I was not able to find it. But this is typical. This is for Philadelphia. You can see there are a whole bunch of Presbyterian churches, and many of them have this register, and it will list the person's name, and give information about when they joined, how they were joined, whether it was a profession of faith, whether it was, or whether they came from somewhere else. And then they'll also say where they went. So, you know, somebody who died, where they went onto another church. But I have seen in these, from what church. Sometimes the name of an exact church in Scotland, sometimes the name of a town. It varies. I've only a couple times found the actual certificate that they brought from the church in Scotland, but I don't know whether those are preserved elsewhere, right? Some of them are preserved elsewhere and some of them were not kept. And it's a lot of, it would be tracking it down. It might be worth contacting the church once you've identified that. But as I said, they've got about 5 million records at Ancestry from Presbyterian churches. So that gives you a really fairly good shot at finding somebody in the family. And finally, here's an interesting one. This is from the Maine State Archives in World War II, during World War II, well, actually before the US joined the war. The state of Maine required everyone who was not a US citizen but living in Maine to register in an alien registration. And these records have just recently gone up at the Maine State Archives website. And they do have information about the person. It gives a place of birth, it gives where they're currently living, their occupation, a birth date, how long they've been in Maine, not necessarily how long they've been in the US. That's in a separate one. And as I've looked at these are not always completely accurate at the couple I've looked for in more detail. Whether they can read and write English, have they applied for citizenship? And so these are really very useful. You will find that most of the people with Scottish last names like MacDonald and McPherson and so on actually came from New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, not from Scotland. As I was trying to find people who lived in Scotland, who were from Scotland, I actually used the census to find them, because going just by the name, I kept getting people from New Brunswick. And here's another one, again, exact date of birth. She's working in a mill. She's living in Saco, but works in the neighboring town of Biddeford. She has actually started the process of immigration or of naturalization, but obviously because she's in the alien registrations, that has not been finished. So those are the basic places I look for information. There are others, towns, the newspaper social columns. I have looked at, I have found information indeed in probate records, but those are long enough shots that I'm not, in the time I have, I'm not going to do them. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I'm glad to help and see if I can help you figure out where people might have been and where they came from. And I'm glad to answer questions by email or here at the conference. So I hope this helped you, give you some ideas about where to look for the origins of your ancestors who moved from Scotland to the US.